Okay, good. All right. Welcome to the Geospatial Forum, and we're very happy to have Daniel McCoy presenting his work on clouds, I think, and how he uses GIS and T. He's got a background in physics and then in atmospheric science, and you are in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences.
That's us.
Yeah, so welcome. Thanks so much for coming to our Geospatial Forum.
I really appreciate the invite. I'm really interested to talk about generally what I work on to audience I usually don't chat with as much. And so as is tradition with my talks, I've retitled this slightly because I gave a title and then I started working on the talk and I realized that they're going to be slightly different. And so what I'm going to talk about today is aerosol cloud interactions. And really the problem with aerosol cloud, not the problem, but one of the things about aerosol cloud interactions is that the way that aerosol affects clouds is a relatively small signal relative to stuff, this is the Southern Ocean, relative to like cyclones, right? If there's a ton of aerosol out one day, you wouldn't expect it to drastically change the weather. So it's really just a problem of looking for kind of small signals in big, noisy geographic data. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about the background of why this is interesting to do in a broad sense, which is that future warming, like most fields, climate science and atmospheric science are concerned with predicting the future. Future warming is strongly determined, or rather constrained, I think, by the amount of historical net warming and cooling that has happened and what we've seen actually happen. I'll go over this a lot more, but this is a nice figure from my colleague Duncan's recent Nature climate change paper. This is years in the future. These are all predictions. This is the historical data where we've actually gone out and put thermometers out in various places and measured the temperature. And these colors are different potential cooling scenarios from aerosol that could have happened. So rather confusingly, the red colors are stronger historical cooling, and the blue colors are weaker historical cooling. And that's because they're stronger future warming. So they're highly constrained in what they could do color-wise. And so the reason this is happening basically is that whenever you burn something, any combustion is going to generate a couple of things. It's going to generate some greenhouse gases, and it's going to generate most likely aerosol, unless you clean it up a lot. And that's a key point to make, or potentially aerosol precursors. And so this is a fun historical photo from a little bit north of where I went to do my postdoc, where you can see there's a factory here. I think these are all worker houses in Bradford, actually. And the factory plume is, obviously interacting with at least visible radiation in this photograph. So if you ultimately understanding how the Earth system responds and has behaved, it's really just energy conservation. And so you want to know what the net flow of energy is into the system. And we can break down the historical net flow of energy into contributions from various anthropogenic components. And this is from IPCC report. The positive values in watts per meter squared are warming, and negative is defined as cooling on this plot. And so there's, several things that pop out immediately. Of course, volcanic aerosol from like deep stratospheric injections that go off and they drastically cool the climate, right, for a short period of time. We can see various greenhouse gases here in purple, brown, and green for CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. You can see they all have sort of a positive warming effect. Right? You put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, they decrease the flow of infrared radiation out to space. And you'll notice that on the other side of this are tropospheric aerosols. They tend to cool the climate. And I'll get into why they do that in a moment. The thing I'd like you to particularly pay attention to is that the little shaded region is pretty small around CO2, and the shaded region around aerosols is really, really big. So we're not very sure how much cooling they've done. This is the same plot, just averaged over time. So this is the net change in energy flow into the Earth system since 1750, based on various lines of evidence. And positive values are warming, negative are cooling again. And so the problem is that we're pretty good at calculating infrared spectroscopy. So these have relatively small error bars. And the error bar on aerosols is pretty big, and that carries over to the overall error bar on the net energy flow. So what we really want to do, the reason I do what I do in my work, is trying to reduce this bar a little bit. And that's kind of the end, that's the end goal. So anyway, thank you for coming to my talk. So how does aerosol cool change net flow radiation, cooling the planet? We're going to talk about a couple of different things. My research is on aerosol cloud interactions, but I'll talk about both briefly. Direct effects, quite straightforward to understand. Light comes in and it tends to scatter back out to space. So they're referred to as direct aerosol effects. What I do are indirect effects. And so this is where aerosols change something about the clouds, and then the cloud interacts with the radiation. That's why it's indirect. The aerosol has to be moderated by some cloud. And of course, direct effects aren't particularly new science, and we can see them on an average day. So, they'll reflect light back to space. So direct effects, pretty straightforward to understand. Indirect effects take a little extra explanation, which is that for clouds to form, you need a couple of things. You need the air to be above 100% relative humidity, but for reasonable supersaturations, reasonable relative humidities you might encounter in the atmosphere, you also need some sort of grit for it to form on. And this is also not particularly new science. And I thought about bringing my classroom demo where I pressurize a bottle and then put some aerosol in it, make a cloud, but I had to run from a class and it just seemed like it was a little too much. But basically, John Aiken, writing in 1881, says, basically, if we didn't have aerosol in the atmosphere, he refers to dust here, but he means broadly aerosol, we wouldn't really have clouds because we couldn't form the droplets that compose clouds very easily. And so this is this fantastic visualization from one of my PhD mentors. Here's a cloud with droplets, and I added the cloud condensation nuclei, CCN. These are the aerosol in the background. And the thing I'm going to talk about kind of ad nauseum today is the cloud droplet number concentration. And the reason for this is I do indirect effects, and the variable state that moderates how these interface with the clouds broadly is the cloud droplet number concentration. And that's just you take, a little cubic centimeter of your cloud and count the number of droplets in it. So we're going to talk about that variable a lot. The reason this matters to radiation is that we can imagine a couple hypothetical situations. One where we have maybe kind of a pristine, not that much aerosol situation, and we have a cloud, and that cloud ends up splitting its droplets over a few big droplets. It just doesn't have much grit to condense on. Alternatively, you might have somewhere like in that plume from that factory in Bradford, where you have lots and lots of CCN to work with. And that same, let's say, I don't know, there's 2 kilograms of liquid in this cloud. That 2 kilograms of liquid is split over a few big drops here and a bunch of little tiny drops here. And this changes the scattering cross section of the clouds. So this one just has more surface to scatter photons back to space. I've taken the CCN off here for visual clarity, but you can see this pretty easily just with beads in a glass jar. It's just an intrinsic feature of taking something and splitting it up over a bunch of small things. You can work through the geometry yourself. So that's what's historically referred to as the Toomey effect, but it's usually referred to as the first indirect effect through radiative forcing aerosol cloud interactions. And so that's just the changing the scattering efficiency of the clouds. But this change in microphysics can also change the way that these clouds evolve. And I will caveat this, that this is all warm liquid clouds. Those seem to be the ones that drive a lot of the forcing historically. So this is all above 0 Celsius. Cloud adjustments are kind of complicated. I think it's all kind of complicated. These ones are pretty complicated. Is that one thing is that potentially you can have a raining cloud here. If you increase the cloud droplet number concentration, it makes it harder to rain out. So the cloud might stick around for longer. But the other thing that can happen is if you have dry air above the cloud, which usually happens, the entrainment efficiency is higher for a higher number of cloud droplets, just due to rate of cooling at cloud top. And so the problem is you can change the cloud droplet number concentration. We know that this increases scattering. We don't have a great idea which one of these effects dominates, whether you get longer lasting or shorter lasting clouds. Cool. So just loop back to the overall explanation of why this is interesting to do in an energy balance sense. So I really like this analogy, so I'm going to reflect it all on you. But basically, I developed this for outreach, and I just so enamored with it. So you can imagine you have a box on a warehouse floor. And we have our buddy greenhouse gases. We know them well. They're pushing the box towards the right on the warehouse floor towards warming. And we have a mysterious stranger, aerosols, pushing the opposite direction. And because of it has animations. We know this one really well. And we don't really know that much about the mysterious stranger. But we've seen the box shift across the floor. And so what we really want to know is, what is the bottom of this box made out of? Is it greased up? Is it sandpaper? And when eventually aerosols leaves for the day, what happens to the box? Does it like scoot across the warehouse floor, or does it just move a little bit? And so this is my graduate work, my professional work up till now. And I will say, I have an NSF proposal rejected because someone didn't understand this. So, so I don't know. But basically, we want to know how hard aerosols are pushing so that we can understand the sensitivity of the climate. What is the bottom of the block made out of? And of course, we know that aerosols are pretty detrimental to human health. And so a lot of governments have tried to reduce the amount of aerosol emissions, and aerosol have a relatively short residence time in the atmosphere. So unlike greenhouse gases. So we really need to understand sort of whether we're in the strong or weak aerosol cooling regime historically to understand where we live in the future. Okay, so that's the underpinning of why, and the next question is how. And to look at aerosol cloud interactions, you kind of have two options. One is to just fly around in them. And the other one is you can try to do something from space where you try to see these things interacting remotely. And so I'm going to talk about this first. And we do have, pretty decent satellite data, at least supporting the idea that aerosol and clouds interact. So these are some nice ship tracks off the coast of Portugal here. And you can see there's this layer of clouds that are developing. You get these really artificial looking straight lines. These are from ships going out and burning marine diesel, and it affects the clouds either through just radiation alone or through changing the way they're precipitating, so they stick around for longer. A colleague of mine asked, I tried to go dig up this paper before the talk, and I got sidetracked. One of the fun things is that you can do this measuring ship transponders and look at how often they actually appear. But also there's some places where ships turn off their transponders, but they still leave a ship track. So you can go look at various places where there's not totally legal shipping happening and see ship tracks. It's kind of cool. And again, this is a geography problem, right? So you can actually see, so ships are a relatively small thing. They're not necessarily emitting a ton of aerosol relative to just industrial activity. And so this is a nice paper from my colleague Bella, looking at what we call city tracks, which are the emissions tracks left by industrial activity on land. And so the colors here are the cloud droplet size, and the white colors here are sky glow from cities and industrial activity. And so what you can see is that for these two mega cities, there's actually sort of a track that's left behind them as the atmosphere moves over them and it mixes into the cloud layer. This is the same, same paper showing tracks from fires in Siberia. So you can see, the fires at the beginning of each of these little things, and then the plume of aerosols mixes into the clouds and changes the droplets to being small. Here's a zoom in of a smelting plant in Manitoba. You can see this track after it. And I was saying about transponders, you can also look at the number of ships with transponders turned on going through, for instance, the Panama Canal here. And you can see there's actually quite strong correspondence between the number of tracks, these artificial straight things that are detected in the satellite data. And you can do the same thing around, this is the Cape of Good Hope here. This is the sulfur emissions from this one very consistent, highway through the Atlantic. And this is the cloud droplet number concentration that you can measure from space. And you can see this straight line that just follows this. Okay, so how do we actually constrain this? And so this is the thing we're interested in. This is the actual cooling. It's this big chain rule, so I know I can snap and talk more or less, or the only equation. And all it's saying is, this is how much emissions have changed. This is how much has changed the number of cloud condensation nuclei. This is how those cloud condensation nuclei change the number of cloud droplets. And this is how that change in the cloud droplets change the radiation. And so this work I'm going to show momentarily is trying to constrain this part of it and figure out how much our emissions have changed the number of cloud droplets. And this is all work based on remote sensing. One of the problems with remote sensing is it's not terribly good at sensing very small things. It's kind of looking through the entire depth of the troposphere and trying to see droplets and little tiny aerosol particles that have like a micrometer width. So we actually supplemented this with some modeling work. This is the NASA aerosol reanalysis. And so it's very cool looking. Each of the colors is a different species of aerosol. Different species of aerosol are going to do different things as cloud condensation nuclei. Sulfur, for instance, really likes to take up liquid, so it works really efficiently. And these white colors are actually sulfate aerosol blowing off of primarily the east coast of Asia and North America. These are biomass burning, sea spray, and dust, by the way. So we take this data set, which is actually kind of an interesting data set because it combines a model which knows things like, this part of Africa tends to burn during biomass burning season, and merges it with remote sensing observations. And it comes up with what's called a reanalysis. So it nudges the model to be as close to observations as we can get. But the cool thing is we can say, well, I know that's dust, which doesn't work very well. CCM, I know that's sulfate, and I know it's kind of near the cloud based on this model output. Of course, that model doesn't actually have aerosol cloud interactions in it. So we want to look at how the cloud droplet number concentration has been affected by those changes in aerosol. And so this is cloud droplet number concentration from the moderate resolution imaging spectroradiometer. It's a passive satellite. And what you can see is that a high number of cloud droplets kind of corresponds to where we have a lot of those sulfate emissions, which is not too surprising. So a priori what we expect. You can see some pretty cool stuff. Let's try to work with my iPad to expand it. You can see a kill lake here. You can actually see the volcanic track off of it, which is quite cool. We'll get back to that in a moment. So just do some analysis on it. You take those two data sets and you spin it up by different regions just to show your analysis is semi-robust. This is a log-log plot of the relationship between cloud droplet number concentration and aerosol, or sulfate mass, excuse me. And what you can see is that it's actually pretty much all following along the same power law relationship. This is 2 orders of magnitude on the bottom here, right? So you have really pristine regions and really polluted regions, and they're all following along the same power law relationship. But of course, as I often discuss in my analysis classes, correlation is not causation. And so we want to look for causal stuff. And a good place to start looking for a causal aerosol to cloud relationship is look at emission controls and volcanism, because those just change. They dramatically change the way aerosol enters the atmosphere. And we can see some evidence of this happening. So this is a surrogate, another satellite data set looking at sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere from the ozone monitoring instrument. It's a little out of date now, it's an older publication, but what you can see is that sulfur dioxide column density has, in dots of units, has decreased over both the east coast of the US and East Asia. So it's really dropped over even this relatively short time span that this publication was from. So emission controls, right? We can also look at volcanism. So this I looked at the top 2 degassing volcanoes. So these aren't like the deep Plinian eruptions for like Pinatubo. This is something like this, where it's just dumping sulfur dioxide down to there. And so the archipelago of Vanuatu is actually like, I think, the number 2 emitter in the world of sulfur dioxide. And so you can see this is sulfur dioxide from that ozone monitoring instrument. This is cloud droplet number concentration from that other satellite. And this is the sulfate from that model. And they all sync up pretty well, actually. So during periods of intense volcanism, the cloud droplet number concentration goes up. So pretty clearly a causal relationship, right? The cloud droplet number concentration is not causing fine wattage to erupt. Although there's a colleague of mine who's very anti-aerosol cloud interactions, has made the argument that perhaps something about precipitation on Kilauea makes it. Anyway, more or less, I think. So this is Kilauea. Kilauea is actually number one. And this is a little out of date too, and I'd love to update this with the recent eruption. There's a huge crustal destabilization in 2008. You can actually see the plume of fog just in real color on the image coming off it. This is a 3 sigma change in cloud droplet. Like there's not that many things in nature that are 3 sigma, 3 standard deviations. So the other cool thing you can do is you can look at emission controls. So this is for East Asia and North America. And what you can generally see from this plot is that all these sulfate emissions go down and it kind of drags the clouds after it. For fun, you can go through and try to relate specific wiggles in that time series to specific geopolitical. This isn't my analysis, by the way. This is other people looking at sulfate. And so the big drop in 2008 is hypothesized by some authors to be related to the Beijing Olympic Games. The fact it doesn't bounce right back up after the ending ceremonies is hypothesized to be due to the economic recession. But then I think the most sort of reasonable thing is in 2012, the 5th 5-year plan had emission controls in it. And so it really decreases. The image of LBJ signing something was the 1963 Clean Air Act, which is before the satellite, before Aqua launched. But for instance, 2009, it seemed possible that that drop is related to the Clean Air Interstate Rule. In 2010, I'm not quite sure what's happening there, but various authors have hypothesized this due to the acid rain program being signed. Okay, so the last few minutes here that I have, I'm going to try to talk a little bit more about machine learning, which is what I promised to do for this talk. So you might say, okay, great. So going back to our original reason for doing this is trying to predict the future, right? We're trying to take our climate modeling work and put in reasonable aerosols, reasonable clouds, and then predict what, things are going to look like. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about how a climate model works. And this is 1913 visualization of the climate model by Brian Richardson of turbulence fame. He used to work at the UK Met Office. And this is he, of course, is doing this completely in a sort of goofy way intentionally, but you have this big spherical room and it's split off into little cubes. And in each cube, you have human computers because, of course, what's a silicon computer in 1913, right? And they each do calculations for like Navier-Stokes and stuff and then hand it off to the person next to them. And he's like, maybe one day we'll have a better way than doing this pencil and paper. Boy, was he right. And so, so this is pretty much how it works, though, right? Currently, models have a 25 kilometer to 100 kilometer grid spacing. In each of those grids, you try to solve some equations and use that to predict something. One of the issues is that really you're never going to resolve clouds and aerosol because they're micrometer scale. So, I mean, you're just not going to get, it's a finite resolution model. You're always going to leave those unresolved. Here's the updated version that doesn't have people, pencil paper mapping. And so in each of those grid cells, you're trying to solve all these different processes, clouds, precipitation, land surface, etc. And to do that, you basically have a big Excel sheet. So you have some equations that you base on your understanding of how aerosol and clouds behave. And you've come up with those equations, you try to generalize them to your grid cell, you put in some numbers and you try to evolve those for it. And, there's approximations. This is what clouds actually look like. This is what they look like in a model. And so this generates what's called parametric uncertainty. So how you parameterize how a cloud responds to aerosol has uncertainty in how much cooling from aerosol you think has been caused by aerosol cloud interactions. And historically, I think about the last 20 years or so, you had like 5 people get together in a room and come up with what the parameterization was and say, I really like 5 for this number. Put it in. And you check and make sure that the model kind of looks like reality, and that's as best as you could do. But one of the things we can do now through a combination of high performance computing and kind of judicious use of machine learning is you can systematically explore that uncertainty space. So something I've been doing a lot in my group recently is working with people at NCAR on what's called a perturbed parameter ensemble. or PP, we use that acronym a lot. And so to explain this, I'm going to show you the simplest possible model with one parameterization and two uncertain parameters. This happens to be the conversion of cloud to rain. And so this rate, this is just the equation that's in your grid cell, is some coefficient times the amount of cloud to the B and the number of droplets to the C. So as you increase the number of droplets, the amount of cloud to rain goes down, so you get adjustments. Anyway, the problem is that you get your buddies together and you say, okay, for whatever reason, so I can draw this, let's say A is certain, but we have no idea what B and C are. We think they're somewhere between these values, but there's no clear physical reasoning to say it's one of these values within this range. We just know what the probable physically reasonable range is. And so if you had a ton of computer time, you could just run, each version of your climate model, varying B and C over a grid. And you get, let's say, some observable like cloud, how much cloud there is, the fraction of cloudiness. Things in the Earth system tend to be highly nonlinear and kind of lumpy. So you have to actually sample this pretty well. And then, of course, the thing we want to know is the unobservable, which is the historical aerosol forcing. And of course, it's a climate model. So we just take our climate model and we type in, run this in 1750, and then you take the difference that gives you your aerosol. And so we might say, great. I know that red colors are consistent with what we see from space. And so we throw out all the parts of B and C space that aren't consistent with those red colors, and that constrains aerosol forcing. This is the simplest possible option. Of course, the problem is that we don't really have two uncertain parameters. We have hundreds of parameters. And you can't run all of them simultaneously, sampling each evenly. So this is work I've been doing with the CAM6 Community Atmosphere Model version 6. There's 45 parameters that we think are pretty important for aerosol cooling. And we want to look at all of them. And you'll notice that that's the number of samples to the 45th power. So you can't run that many simulations, right? It's not possible. So what we do is you shotgun down all the parameters randomly at the same time. This is a two-dimensional visualization of that. So I run, let's say, 5 versions of the model, and then use a Gaussian process in this case to actually create a surrogate model. So you fill in this little wiggly surface, we fill that in with Gaussian process. And that allows us to take something that would be a full integration of the model, and then we can just run it through this nice, simple prediction that takes like a fraction of a second. These are all the parameters, by the way, if you're interested. So these are all just things in the code, and you vary them over randomly. When you do this, you get a model that really does a lot of different stuff. This is the aerosol cooling from aerosol cloud interactions in the model. Each of the gray bars is one of 262 simulations we do, randomly sampling the space in that 45-dimensional parameter space. And this is work that was led by C, actually. And the blue line is the Gaussian process emulator. That's millions and millions of emulated surrogate models that take a fraction of a second to run. The dashed red line is the default model. So we can explore really strong aerosol cooling or almost no aerosol cooling at all relative to the control run of the model. Just a quick comment, what Gaussian process is it's a machine learning method. I'm very fond of it because it works really well if you can choose what your constraints are. So you can set up your experiment basically. Essentially, you have an infinite possible family of potential curves that exist. These are just 3, example ones. And then you constrain those potential curves that can go through those points. And that generates a reduced number of potential surfaces that can fit. This is a 1D example. But it works really well in this case because we can say, I want to put down a simulation exactly here in the parameter space. And then that, kind of squeezes in the potential area that you're fitting through. Let me go a little quick over this because I realize I'm running a little short on time. But so what can you do with this? So we've done this big complicated thing. We've run 260 versions of the NCAR model. We've fit these surrogate models to it. How do we actually come up with something physical? And one of the things we can do is we can try to constrain the aerosol cooling using remote sensing. And so this is the Southern Ocean. It's really interesting to look at because it gives us an idea of what the baseline was in 1750. It tells us kind of what the pre-industrial state was, because you'll notice there's not a ton of industry in here. It's really cool actually, because this is summer and this is winter. There's a huge cycle in cloud droplet number concentration because there's a marine phytoplankton that emit sulfur-containing compounds. So it gives us an idea of what the oceans looked like in 1750. This is some older work in the UK computer physics ensemble, just sort of demonstrating this. This is the north to south difference, where north acts as a surrogate to what today is, right, obviously. And the south is kind of what we think 1750 looked like. And so as we get bigger present day to pre-industrial differences, we get more aerosol cooling. The crosses are individual simulations, and the shaded region is a 1 million member surrogate ensemble based on Gaussian process. So I'm going to tie this into another machine learning thing I'm doing, which is that when we kind of try to constrain this, one of the problems is that actually none of the climate models we surveyed in that study really had the Southern Ocean NB high enough. So you just couldn't get high enough cloud droplet number concentration over this really remote, pristine area. It was really kind of fascinating. So this is observations, this is the models. And you can see that they say, yeah, 1750 versus now, and red and blue lines are pretty much the same in the Southern Ocean, but they don't look like the satellite. One of the issues with satellite remote sensing from passive spectrometers is that this is the assumption, is that you have a cloud that's perfectly uniform and it fills the grid cell, and it's over a perfectly uniform surface, and the sun comes down and hits it, it bounces right off, which then goes into an equation like this, where this is the optical thickness of the cloud, and this is the size of the droplets, which you infer based on some other stuff. The problem is I regret to inform you that clouds do not look like that. They look more like this. So it doesn't necessarily conform to our underlying remote sensing assumptions. So something I've been doing in collaboration with people at NASA Langley is trying to use more than one observation set and merging them in kind of a sensible way to then better measure cloud droplet number concentration, because it's possible the models aren't agreeing with remote sensing because remote sensing is wrong. So this is Calliope. It's a LiDAR, so it bounces a laser beam off the top of the clouds. It's super cool because it doesn't care what the surface is, because it's vertically resolved. It just sees the cloud top. And it doesn't need the light to be out because it's bouncing a laser off of them. It makes its own light. And it has a really tiny, well, it doesn't have a really tiny, it has very fine resolution relative to the passive spectrometer, which I'm showing here. It's just a camera, right? But it has like I forget, 4 or 5 kilometer resolution. Don't hold me to it. The problem you'll notice with this is a really small sample, and this is a nice big image of all of the Earth. So your sample size is really small. So we'd like to unify these with a big sample size, but also more accurate retrievals. And so this is work that Brandon Lopez in my group is doing, trying to use random forest essentially to take all the information we can measure from all the different wavelengths on MODIS and seeing if that has information about stuff that we know breaks the remote sensing assumptions. So like cloud lumpiness, for instance, we know that if it breaks it, we can kind of measure that from MODIS, but it's not in the remote sensing retrieval, which is just that tau over an RE thing. Surface brightness, for instance, and so on. And one of the things that Brandon's working on is trying to sort of unpack this black box a little bit and understanding why the retrieval breaks. So some obvious stuff like the surface albedo when you're like over ice. That's very hard to do the remote sensing retrieval because it kind of assumes a dark surface. So this is the correction from the random forest as a function of the surface albedo. So way over here, we have to correct it a ton. We can also look at kind of interesting things like the fact that precipitation breaks the remote sensing retrieval. And so this is the correction in the random forest to the MODIS retrieval based on cloud droplet radius. And we know that over here, this is the point where precipitation starts to set in. So we can do these things that allow us to, one, make the big, wide, great sample MODIS data look like this really high quality thin LiDAR data. We can also understand why it's doing that. So big drum roll. Well, when we do that, we have our LiDAR data. It still doesn't totally agree with the GCM. So this is kind of interesting, is that this is the LiDAR data. This is that MODIS camera data I showed you earlier. This is the mature physics ensemble from C's work. And it just doesn't, it gets closer. And we think there's good reason for that, but it's not quite the same. So the last thing I wanted to talk about here is that one thing that makes sense when you're trying to constrain aerosol cloud interactions, you probably want observations kind of at the scale of aerosol and clouds, right? You're looking down from space, it's kind of indirect. So you can use, aircraft, which are a bit more on the scale of what you want to be looking at. Of course, they have even worse sampling than LiDAR, right? Because it's expensive to fly them around and you can't really fly them a ton. But their data is really, really high quality. So the question is, can we use this really like sparsely sampled data to constrain a global model? And so what C's been doing is looking at these two field campaigns. This is one between Hawaii and LA. And this is one where they just flew out into the Southern Ocean and then flew back. And so what we do is we take that mature physics ensemble, we run it with the right weather conditions for those two different field campaigns, and we output data along flight tracks. So we have data sampled the same way that the aircraft saw it. And that seems to work pretty well. So we're actually observing stuff with instruments that are really calibrated to observe droplets. And this is work that C has done where this is the cloud droplet number concentration from the actual field campaigns on the x-axis. These colors are the different model simulations sampled the same way. And the y-axis is the pre-industrial to present day change in cloud droplet number. So this is important for controlling the cooling because we have that big long chain rule. Well, we can just sort of take this and compress it into one big chain rule, and that's just delta ND. So that's this variable. And so when C takes those surrogate models and throws out all the ones that don't look like these two times we had as the NCAR G5 actually out. You can substantially constrain the prior range in blue here in pre-industrial present day change in cloud droplet number concentration to be quite a bit tighter than we would know otherwise. So with that, I'll wrap up the science part of my talk. Quick plug for our department. If you're unaware, we have a research aircraft, the King Air. The old one just got decommissioned, been flying since 1977. Yes, and so here it is decommissioned, but there's a new one coming online and it's looking like it's going well. And I don't know if we're going to stick with the red and black paint color or try to question for Jeff. I bring this up because one of the things is that it can be requested for your own research through NSF track through funding through GEO. 25% is reserved for UW projects. And Jeff is, again, our department head is the contact for that. And it's done interesting stuff in the past, like mapping stream flow with this spectrometer. This was on the old aircraft, of course. So just a quick plug. Okay, so with that, I'm actually on time. I'll summarize. So climate system is complicated. It has processes that are ranging from the micrometer to, of course, global scales. I mean, this thing is made up of these things. And trying to represent all of those in a finite resolution model is difficult. There's a lot of uncertainty in representing these processes. One of the nice things is that if we're judicious about how we run our simulations and how we try to explore that uncertainty space with machine learning, we can actually come up with relatively decent constraints. And once we do that, we need good observations of all of these things. And they're hard to observe, right? They're hard to observe across these scales. And so learning how to directly confront observations of things like this with a global model is also something that I think is an exciting area of growth for the field. So anyway, thanks for your attention. Yeah, that's what I got.
And we'll take questions.
Okay.
We may have some folks from online as well, and you can help us with that.
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. My question is about how you manage your data and how you share your data and for others to, maybe reproduce research and,
For sure.
and what are some of the challenges with that? I'm guessing this is high volume stuff.
It is high volume. So there's a lot of different, I would say overall, the field is pretty decent at data sharing. So like all the data I'm showing, for instance, all the satellite data, if it's a NASA satellite, it's stored on a DAC, which is distributed access. Anyway, it's a distributed data file system. I forget what the acronym is, sorry. Calliope's pretty good to access. So the problem is these are run by slightly different groups. Calliope is actually quite good to access, and it's relatively low volume data. MODIS is infamously terrible to access, and actually I know people at Goddard that walk over to the building on Goddard with a hard drive rather than try to download it. It's getting better, but it is there, it's accessible. One of the things Brandon's working on is figuring out an automated way to pull this data and process it so that you don't just sit with all of it on your computer. It's a live processing thing. For things like the climate model data, these red lines, those are stored by the Program for Climate Model Diagnostics and Intercomparison, which is sort of a subset of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's actually kind of a triumph of big science, is that these are all run, so I have them listed here. This is the UK model, this is the US model, this one's the German model, and I think Sprintar's might be Japanese, but don't hold me to it. These are all different people, probably writing in different languages, producing slightly different output, but they've managed to create this unified data archive with all the same format, all the same variables, and you can just go download them. For our perturbed physics ensemble runs, those are ones we're doing in-house. They're stored on NWSC. So there's not a good, because they're kind of bespoke, there's not a unified place to store them. It'd be great if there was a bit better.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Now, for the MODIS data, we use individual scenes or composite. And also, given that while it's there, how do we deal with those when you go towards the edges? When the pixel may be covering a lot more area than what it says.
These are all really good questions. So when we do this, there's about 3 LiDAR shots per pixel. So what Brandon's doing is averaging up those LiDAR shots into a pixel and then using that to train the random forest. So you want the random forest to agree with this, but you have 3 different estimates of whatever cloud property within that pixel. Typically, so Calliope and MODIS used to be in the A train, and they used to fly information, so it was always in the middle of that pixel. Unfortunately, the A train is running out of gas, and NASA's kind of being a little stingy about it. One aspect of that is now we have the C train, and CloudSat and Calypso have drifted, and so now they're moving out across the swath. We haven't started messing with that data yet and trying to understand how to average it. One exciting thing is it will make us able to understand how much we should trust retrievals from outside in the swath here, because all we have is basically straight up and down right underneath the nadir pointing. Oh, yeah.
So thinking about some of this kind of data that's crowdsourced, and thinking about all of the commercial aircraft that fly all over the globe, is there a way to eventually get maybe some kind of a sensor on that kind of aircraft to tell you droplet size, or is that just too, it's amazing now, we actually have LiDAR systems on a new smartphone, right? Which is kind of amazing. Not as resolute or whatever as the research rate, but
I think that's a really good point, right? Is that commercial aircraft fly quite a bit in the northern hemisphere, have really great sampling. They do sample some stuff, temperature, humidity, and stuff. Yeah. I'm looking at Jeff because I have no idea how expensive it would be to put CDP on a commercial aircraft. I actually don't have a good conception of that at all.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good question. So yes, a number of there are a number of systems for making basic MET measurements on commercial aircraft and those data, right, are generated and they're actually used in operational forecast models all the time. However, for parameters, such as cloud droplet number and more difficult parameters like that, the measurements are much less straightforward. And I've not heard of any ideas of trying to do that with commercial aircraft.
I mean, it would be great. Yeah. I guess you'd only get it on the way up because it's probably icy, like on the way down, right?
Not necessarily, right? I mean, right, there's ways to do that. And, you could also use remote sensing and things like that. I think a lot of it would be cost, right, associated with that. So the basic met variables that they're measuring are utilizing. They're relatively expensive instruments that provide more detailed measurements and remote sensing would be quite expensive.
I'll ask one more question, since you are using polar algorithm. So when you do your comparisons, do you see any difference in view when you take observations near the pole versus those that are coming from the equator? Because it's polar algorithm satellites, less overlap. So you may get better quality data.
Yeah.
And the ones in the equator.
So that's a good point. One of the things that LiDAR is really good at is for a lot of stuff with MODIS. I mean, these are fine information, so they sample the same way, just much narrower than Calliope. But MODIS over the poles is not great for two reasons. One is that the surface tends to be kind of bright during the summer. And the other is that during the winter, it doesn't have any solar radiation coming in. So you lose a ton of stuff. And actually, one of the exciting things about the LiDAR is that even though it has this really, LiDAR swath, right? It actually has pretty good sampling over the poles. And so one of the cool things we've been able to see is there's this like potentially near ice edge increase in cloud droplet number concentration that starts in the period where we wouldn't really be able to see it with MODIS because it isn't really bright out yet. But we actually have really good sampling because it's crossing over so much. All right. Well,
Thanks so much, Dan.
thank you so much.